The bells of Westminster rang hollow beneath a pale London sky, echoing across the grey river and through the crooked streets where merchants shuttered their stalls before dusk. England felt tired. The age of conquest, the glorious campaigns of Edward III and his son the Black Prince, had faded into memory. The banners that once flew proudly over Calais now drooped in the damp air of disillusion. What had once been a kingdom of triumphs had become a realm of exhaustion and mistrust. The people remembered victories they could no longer afford, and a court that seemed lost in its own reflection. The treasury was empty, the nobility divided, and the peasants, weary from years of taxation and plague, whispered that God had turned his face away. In the midst of this weariness stood King Richard II, grandson of Edward III, crowned when he was barely 10 years old. To the realm, he was a boy, king born in a shadow of glory too vast to fill. To himself, he was something more than a man. Richard believed that kingship was sacred, that the crown on his head was not a gift of men, but a mark of divine favor. He cultivated an image of majesty that bordered on the spiritual. He ordered his likeness painted with a golden halo, as if to remind all who looked upon him that his rule came not from parliament or blood, but from heaven. In his eyes, disobedience was not a crime against the crown, but a sin against God. He loved beauty, ceremony, and the language of reverence. The court of Richard II shimmered with gold and ritual. Poets praised him as a second Solomon. Courtiers bowed until their backs ached. The king surrounded himself with flatterers who spoke of divine right and celestial authority, men who encouraged his belief that he was chosen for greatness. Yet beneath the splendor, the realm suffered. The Black Death had emptied villages. Harvests faltered. Taxes, raised again and again to fund royal projects, fell hardest on those with the least to give. The peasants who had once revolted in 1381 remembered how young Richard had faced them bravely and promised reform. Those promises had dissolved into silence. The years had hardened him. He had learned to command obedience, not loyalty. Among the nobles, discontent grew like rot under polished wood. The king's extravagance and favoritism deepened the fractures left by his grandfather's wars. Old families, once proud supporters of the crown, now found themselves stripped of lands or dismissed from office. Richard replaced them with favorites, men of little lineage but great devotion to his person. To the common people, the court glittered like a world apart. To the lords, it was an insult, a theater where a vain monarch played a divinity while the kingdom crumbled. Richard walked the halls of Westminster like an actor certain of his role. Yet even anointed kings must live in the real world. The merchants of London, the knights of the shires, and the earls who commanded armies began to ask a dangerous question. If a king forgets his duty to his realm, do his subjects still owe him theirs? Amid this quiet rebellion of hearts stood another figure, one whose destiny would soon collide with Richard's. Henry Bolingbroke was born to the red blood of Lancaster, son of John of Gaunt, soldier, statesman, and uncle to the king. If Richard was the mirror of majesty, Henry was its contrast, practical, grounded, a man who measured worth by action rather than appearance. Where Richard delighted in ritual, Henry preferred discipline. Where the king believed in divine right, Henry believed in the duty of a ruler to those he ruled. Their kinship should have bound them together, but the court had no room for two sons. In their youth, they had been companions, jousting side by side, laughing in the same halls, yet each carried the echo of a different England. Richard belonged to a kingdom of vision and ceremony, Henry to a land of labor and endurance. To the lords, Henry was the man they trusted. To the people, he was the noble who spoke plainly and kept his word. John of Gaunt's influence had long steadied the realm, but age weakened him and suspicion surrounded his house. Richard's jealousy toward his cousin deepened with every rumor of Henry's popularity. To the king, admiration for another was a kind of treason. Henry's successes in foreign campaigns, his courage in Prussia and Lithuania, and his growing support among England's knights made him a threat that could not be ignored. Henry was not ambitious in the way the court whispered. His was a patient ambition, the resolve of a man who waits for his moment rather than seizes it. Yet Richard saw in that patience something dangerous. The crown is a jealous thing. It tolerates no rivals, not even imagined ones. As the decade closed, England was a realm divided between two temperaments, the dreamer and the doer, the divine and the pragmatic. Richard ruled by grace of heaven, or so he believed. Henry lived by the judgment of men, and men, weary of celestial promises, began to look toward the steadier figure in exile, the one who did not speak of angels but of justice. The tension that had lingered for years finally began to twist into open hostility. Richard's court became a place of suspicion. Counselors watched one another as hawks. Paranoia replaced policy. The king's anger turned inward and outward at once. He began to see disloyalty in every hesitation, conspiracy in every silence. Those who had once dared to question him were accused of treason. The heads that fell at Tower Hill were not only enemies, but reminders of how fragile divine rule becomes when divinity feels cornered. Henry Bolingbroke was among those marked by suspicion. A quarrel with another noble, Thomas Mowbray, gave Richard the pretext he needed. The two men were summoned before the crown to settle their dispute by combat. Yet before their swords could cross, Richard intervened. With a gesture, he ended the duel and pronounced his judgment. Both would be banished, Mowbray for life, Henry for 10 years. The king's voice was calm, his expression serene, but the punishment was deliberate, a surgical removal of his most popular subject. When Henry left England in 1398, he did so with dignity. The chroniclers say the crowd wept. Some removed their caps as if for a funeral. To them, this exile was not justice, but fear disguised as authority. Richard had rid himself of a rival, but in doing so, he rid himself of balance. Not long after, John of Gaunt died. His death was the moment when wisdom left the court entirely. The old duke had been the king's shield as much as his son's. With him gone, Richard made the fateful choice that would unmake him. He seized the entire Lancastrian inheritance, estates, titles, and revenues, denying Henry his birthright. It was a violation not just of law, but of the unspoken code that held the realm together. For centuries, the nobility had accepted the king's supremacy because he, in turn, respected their rights. With that act, Richard broke the covenant. England's barons did not rebel immediately. Rebellion was a dangerous word, but something older and quieter stirred: the withdrawal of faith. They began to see in Henry not a rebel, but a remedy. Exiled though he was, he represented a return to fairness, to order, to the England that had been lost beneath layers of gold and ceremony. Richard did not see the change. He could not. Surrounded by sycophants and luxury, he mistook silence for obedience. Yet the silence that filled his court was not loyalty. It was the stillness before the storm. He journeyed to Ireland to suppress unrest, leaving behind a kingdom ready to erupt. In the Chronicles, this is the turning point. The divine king had overreached, and the practical cousin he feared would soon return, not as petitioner, but as challenger. The tides of power that Richard thought eternal began to shift. The last years of his reign moved with the inevitability of tragedy. The more the king clung to the idea of sacred monarchy, the more his people drifted away. The crown still gleamed under torchlight, but the eyes that once looked upon it with reverence now saw only burden and arrogance. In castles and taverns alike, whispers began to circle that the realm needed strength, not splendor, justice, not jewels. They spoke the name Henry Bolingbroke with a kind of cautious hope. It was not rebellion they desired, but restoration. A king who would be one of them, not above them. Richard's final mistake was believing that fear could hold what love had abandoned. The nobles he distrusted most became the hands that would pull him down. When he returned from Ireland, he found the country already lost. The banners of Lancaster fluttered where his own had fallen. But that is the story yet to come. For now, the wind has only begun to rise. The crown still rests upon Richard's brow, heavy with divine pretension, bright with the illusion of permanence. Yet beneath that gold, the metal has already started to crack. England stands on the edge of transformation, a kingdom of ceremony about to meet the reality of rebellion. The ideals of divine right and eternal monarchy will soon collide with the cold facts of human will, and when they do, the world will learn that no throne, however holy, can stand upon the contempt of its people. The storm gathers in silence, its heart already formed in the exiled figure across the sea. Henry Bolingbroke waits patient as iron while the winds of history turn toward him. In the stillness of that waiting, England holds its breath, poised between illusion and awakening, between the sacred and the mortal. The stage is set for a crown to fall and a new one to rise, forged not by birth, but by resolve. And so ends the calm before the tempest, the last flicker of a kingdom that believed itself eternal. The storm that will change England forever is coming, and its name is Henry IV. The year was 1398, and the air in Coventry hung heavy with a strange, expectant silence. The tournament field, once a place of honor and sport, had been transformed into a stage of judgment. On one side stood Henry Bolingbroke, Duke of Hereford, his armor gleaming like tempered conviction. On the other was Thomas Mowbray, Duke of Norfolk, proud, troubled, and uneasy. Between them, seated high upon a raised dais, King Richard II watched, not as a mediator of justice, but as an actor ensuring the script would serve his purpose. It was meant to be a trial of combat, an ancient right that allowed God to decide guilt or innocence through the clash of arms. The lists were built with solemn care. Trumpets waited. Heralds stood ready to cry each name. The crowd, wrapped in winter cloaks, waited for spectacle and truth. Yet as the banners fluttered in the cold wind, few understood they were witnessing not a duel, but the first movement of a tragedy that would soon consume the realm. Henry had accused Mowbray of treason, of plotting against the crown, of spreading whispers that the king's court was corrupt. Mowbray denied it fiercely. Both men had once been loyal servants, both veterans of foreign wars, both bound by pride and honor. But Richard saw in their quarrel a chance to tighten his grip. Justice was no longer blind. It stared with the king's own eyes. When the herald signaled, the two knights advanced, lances lowered, horses stamping the frozen earth. The roar of the crowd rose, then fell abruptly. Richard raised his hand. The gesture was calm, theatrical. The duel stopped before it began. In that moment, the silence of Coventry was almost sacred. The spectators froze. Even the wind seemed to hesitate. Henry and Mowbray stood facing each other, uncertain, their armor creaking softly. Then the king's voice rang out, measured, deliberate, final. The combat was forbidden. The judgment would come not from God, but from the throne. With a tone that disguised punishment as mercy, Richard announced his decision. Thomas Mowbray, Duke of Norfolk, was to be banished for life. Henry Bolingbroke, Duke of Hereford, was to be exiled for 10 years. The crowd gasped, not because of pity for Mowbray, but for Henry, whose name carried respect even among the commoners. A 10-year exile for a loyal subject felt less like discipline and more like betrayal. Henry bowed his head, as if in submission, yet the look in his eyes spoke differently. He did not shout, nor plead, nor curse his king. He simply turned toward the watching nobles, toward England itself, and let silence speak for him. It was the kind of silence that history remembers longer than words. The chroniclers later wrote that the king's decision was guided by fear. Richard, they said, sought not justice, but distance, a way to remove a rival without staining his hands. Yet even distance can plant the seeds of downfall. The day Henry left English soil, the first stone of Richard's ruin was laid. As Henry rode through the gates of London toward exile, the people lined the streets in quiet disbelief. They removed their caps, bowed their heads, some even wept. It was not the departure of a rebel they mourned, but of the only noble they still trusted. In their hearts, a dangerous thought began to take root, that the wrong man was leaving. Richard watched all of it from his palace windows, convinced he had preserved his power. He could not hear the whisper that followed Henry's caravan as it disappeared down the winter road. He will return. The exile became a legend before the ship even reached France. To the court, Henry was gone. To the people, he was waiting. He spent his years abroad in measured patience, learning from foreign courts, studying alliances, cultivating the quiet art of endurance. He did not declare himself wronged. He allowed others to say it for him. The longer he stayed away, the more England remembered him not as a man, but as a promise. Meanwhile, Richard's reign continued to darken. Freed from the presence of his most popular subject, he indulged every impulse unchecked. Taxes increased. Friends became flatterers. The court glittered, but beneath its gold was decay. Those who had once whispered of divine right now whispered of tyranny. The nobility who had watched Henry's banishment in silence began to wonder what would happen when their own loyalty was tested. From exile, Henry's letters spoke with restraint. No rebellion, no defiance, only duty and longing for his homeland. Yet each word reminded those who read it that he had lost what was rightfully his. Justice, once wounded, does not heal in silence. It festers. What happened in Coventry that winter was more than an act of royal command. It was the moment when the sacred bond between king and realm began to unravel. Richard believed he had demonstrated power. In truth, he had revealed weakness, the kind that hides. Behind ceremony and mistakes, fear for control. The story of the exile is not merely political, it is human. It speaks of pride, injustice, and the slow turn of fate. In Coventry, beneath the gray sky and the unstruck swords, the future was already writing itself, not in battle cries, but in the quiet hearts of those who had seen what power could do when it stopped listening. That day, a kingdom learned a lesson it would not forget, that no ruler, however anointed, can silence the sense of fairness that lives within his people. The throne might command obedience, but it cannot command belief. And belief, once lost, begins to move like a tide. As the chroniclers later reflected, every exile carries the weight of return. Henry's departure was not an ending. It was an echo, gathering strength across distance and time. The people spoke his name softly at first, then louder, until even the wind seemed to carry it toward the sea. If you listen closely, history itself seems to whisper through that winter air, that a single act of injustice can remake a kingdom, that the quiet dignity of one man can outlast the splendor of 100 courts. And perhaps that is the truest lesson of Coventry, that power earned through fear will always bow before the memory of fairness. Like the first crack in a frozen river, the exile of 1398 marked the beginning of a thaw. Slow, unseen, unstoppable. Richard believed he had silenced a rival, but what he had really done was give England a reason to hope. And hope, once stirred, has a way of returning. So as you follow this story, remember that every downfall begins not with rebellion, but with injustice left unheeded. If this tale stirs you, if the voice of history moves you, take a moment, stay with the story, listen, reflect, because the past is never truly gone. It waits in the choices we make, in the voices we choose to hear, and in the silence before the storm. The winter of 1399 came quietly, as if the sky itself had grown weary of judgment. England stood still, wrapped in frost, in uncertainty. Far away from court, John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, drew his final breath, the last steady pillar in a realm built on shifting loyalties. His passing was no surprise. Age and illness had been claiming him for months. Yet when the news reached Westminster, it struck the kingdom with the force of prophecy. John of Gaunt was more than a nobleman. He had been the guardian of a generation, the embodiment of an older England, pragmatic, loyal, bound by duty rather than vanity. He had served as soldier, diplomat, and counselor to kings. In his youth, he fought beside the Black Prince. In his age, he tempered the passions of his nephew, Richard II. He had outlived rebellion, plague, and war, and through all of it, he carried the realm's memory of discipline and restraint. His death left a void that no one else could fill. To the people, he had been a name of stability. To the nobles, a bulwark between crown and chaos. And to his son, Henry Bolingbroke, he was both legacy and shield. Yet as the candle of Lancaster went out, Richard saw not loss, but opportunity. When news of Gaunt's death reached the court, the king's reaction was swift, too swift. Without waiting for counsel or consent, he ordered that the entire estate of Lancaster be seized by the crown. Lands that stretched from the Midlands to the north, estates that fed thousands and symbolized centuries of lineage, were declared property of the king. Henry's inheritance was erased with a signature. It was an act that seemed, on the surface, a matter of royal prerogative, a ruler reclaiming his vassals' holdings. But beneath it lay something far more dangerous, the violation of a sacred unwritten law. For generations, the nobility of England had accepted monarchy because monarchy, in return, respected their rights. Property was not merely wealth, it was identity, honor, the proof of one's place in the order of creation. By confiscating Lancaster, Richard broke that ancient covenant. In the silence that followed, the foundations of loyalty began to shift. The dukes and earls who had long tolerated Richard's extravagance and vanity now saw the truth with sudden clarity. If the greatest among them could lose everything with a stroke of the royal pen, then none of them were safe. Power, once bound by law and tradition, had become the whim of one man. The chroniclers record no riots, no shouts, no open defiance. The resistance was quieter, more dangerous. It was the kind that begins in drawing rooms and council halls, in the pauses between polite words, in the glances exchanged over goblets of wine. Behind every bow, behind every oath, suspicion grew. The knights of the shires, the backbone of England's governance, began to murmur among themselves. They were men of order, of duty, of measured loyalty. Yet even they could not ignore what had happened. They had followed Richard through years of tension, believing his excesses were the follies of youth. But now the mask had slipped. The king had not only punished a cousin, he had dismantled the principle that made nobility possible. The confiscation of the Lancaster estates did not just enrich the crown, it impoverished the monarchy's moral authority. The lands of John of Gaunt were more than acres and coin. They were the physical manifestation of continuity, of the contract between the ruler and the ruled. In taking them, Richard declared that law was what he willed it to be, not what time and tradition had made it. Among the people, the reaction was different, but no less telling. In London, craftsmen and merchants shook their heads in disbelief. They had seen kings tax. They had seen kings quarrel, but never had they seen a monarch rob a dead man of his heritage. In taverns and market squares, the name Lancaster began to carry the weight of justice denied. Henry's exile had already made him a symbol of wronged loyalty. Now, robbed of his inheritance, he became the embodiment of righteousness betrayed. Even within the royal council, voices of unease stirred. Some warned the king of the danger. One chronicler wrote that Archbishop Arundel spoke in guarded tones. "Your grace may gain a kingdom's wealth, but lose its heart." Yet Richard, confident in his divine right and surrounded by flatterers, dismissed such counsel as cowardice. He believed that majesty could not be undone by murmurs. In truth, the kingdom's allegiance was unraveling, not with rebellion, but with reflection. Each noble who signed his letters, "Your loyal servant," now did so with an unspoken question in his mind. For how long? The political repercussions spread like cracks in ice. In the north, the Percys hesitated to enforce the king's commands. In the west, sheriffs delayed the collection of royal dues. The network of obedience that once defined medieval governance began to loosen. And all of it, in one way or another, traced back to that single, fateful decree. The day Richard chose to make the wealth of Lancaster his own. To Richard, it was an assertion of authority. To England, it was a confession of fear. Only an insecure king steals from the dead. By taking what was not his, Richard declared, without realizing it, that the crown no longer trusted the realm to obey willingly. From across the sea, in the halls of Paris and the castles of Brittany, Henry Bolingbroke heard the news. Those who stood beside him said he grew silent for a long time, staring into the fire. Perhaps he saw in those flames not anger, but inevitability. His exile had made him patient, but patience had its limit. His father's death had left him grieving. The theft of his birthright left him resolute. And so, with the passing of John of Gaunt, England lost its last balance. The thread that had held Richard's kingship together, the respect between crown and nobility, snapped. The storm that had been gathering now had reason, name, and cause. The seed sown in Coventry had begun to sprout. The death of one man had turned a realm of silence into a realm of waiting. No one yet dared to speak the words aloud, but all who remembered the fairness of John of Gaunt, all who had once admired the dignity of Lancaster, now looked toward the horizon. They knew, as surely as the seasons turn, that Henry would return, not for vengeance, but for restoration. The king had taken everything from him but the one thing that matters most in the making of history, a reason to come home. The summer of 1399 broke with the scent of rain and salt on the northern wind. England, weary and uncertain, slept under a sky of gray and gathering storm. Far out upon the sea, a small fleet approached the coast of Yorkshire. Its sails were tattered, its decks slick with rain. At its bow stood Henry Bolingbroke, no longer the banished noble, but not yet the conqueror history would remember. The spray clung to his face like cold ashes. Behind him, a handful of loyal companions, knights, retainers, men bound not by promise of gold, but by the quiet certainty that history was turning. They had sailed from Brittany in secrecy, their journey carried by rumor more than by wind. The coast rose ahead, steep, damp, dark with heather and mist. There were no trumpets, no banners, no royal heralds to greet them, only the long sigh of the sea and the wet hiss of rain on armor. When Henry stepped ashore, the mud of England clung to his boots. He bent slightly, touched the ground, and whispered a prayer that no one heard. It was not a vow of conquest, it was a vow of belonging. To those few who stood beside him, he seemed less like a rebel and more like a man returning to finish what fate had interrupted. His eyes, steady and watchful, reflected neither anger nor pride, but resolve, the kind of resolve that grows in silence, like roots beneath frozen soil. The chronicles would later romanticize this moment. He came not with armies, but with purpose. And it was true. Henry's first aim was not the throne. He had come to reclaim his inheritance, the lands unjustly taken, the name stripped of honor. Yet destiny, once awakened, rarely follows instruction. The land itself seemed to recognize him. Within days of his arrival, word spread through the villages and strongholds of the north. They said, "The Duke of Lancaster has returned." The news traveled faster than riders could carry it. It crossed rivers and moors, whispered through taverns, echoed in churchyards. To some it was hope, to others it was judgment. In a country weary of taxes, silenced councils, and hollow ceremonies, the return of Lancaster felt like a stirring of conscience. The first to join him were local knights, cautious men, weathered by years of service and disappointment. They came quietly at night, cloaks drawn tight against the rain. They spoke no oaths, only nodded once as soldiers do when words are unnecessary. One by one, man by man, they filled the small encampment until Henry's modest landing became a gathering point of quiet defiance. At dawn, fires flickered across the hillside, casting amber light on soaked fields. Henry stood among them, his cloak heavy with rain, and for the first time in years, England stood with him. It was not charisma that drew them, nor ambition. It was justice, or the longing for it. The confiscation of Lancaster's lands had become the symbol of every wrong the realm had suffered. Each man who joined him carried a private grievance, but together they formed something larger, the outline of a cause. In York, sheriffs hesitated to act. In Bristol, garrisons faltered. In London, whispers reached the merchants' guilds before they reached the palace. The king, away in Ireland, had left the kingdom unguarded, as if he believed the silence of fear would last forever. But fear has limits. Once broken, it turns quickly to courage. Henry advanced not as an invader, but as a restorer. Everywhere he went, he proclaimed the same message. He sought not the crown, but his rightful inheritance. He demanded no rebellion, only fairness. Yet fairness is contagious. Each town that opened its gates saw in him not merely a duke wronged, but a future renewed. The chroniclers tell of the crowds that followed him, farmers, priests, and soldiers alike, and how they shouted his name, not as they would for a lord, but as they would for a deliverer. The rain that soaked their cloaks could not cool the fervor that spread from shire to shire. By the time Henry reached the Midlands, his following had multiplied tenfold. Men who had once sworn loyalty to Richard now rode under Lancaster's banner, not out of treachery, but out of conviction that the realm itself demanded change. He comes for justice, they said, and with justice comes peace. Henry himself remained cautious, almost solemn. In his letters he continued to write as a servant of the king, as though still hoping reconciliation was possible. Yet history has little patience for restraint. Each step he took toward the south brought him closer to something he had not sought, but could no longer avoid. The tide that carried him was no longer his to command. From the mist of Yorkshire to the green plains of Derby, the land seemed to rise beneath his feet. Lords who once feared the king now offered allegiance. Towns that once paid tribute now opened their gates with cheers. A nation that had fallen silent found its voice again. By the time the royal banners were seen on the horizon, Henry was no longer merely a nobleman seeking restitution. He had become the embodiment of a kingdom's conscience. The exile had returned, and with him came something greater than vengeance: the restoration of balance. The chroniclers, always fond of poetry, wrote that a man wronged by a king became the measure of kingship itself. And so it was. The journey that began with exile ended with awakening. The rain that had fallen upon his landing now mingled with the smoke of countless campfires. The realm that once watched in silence now moved as one. Henry's cause had outgrown him. What began as the quiet mission of a dispossessed son had become the movement of a nation reclaiming its soul. And thus the exiled duke stepped not into rebellion, but into destiny. What had begun as the sorrow of one man now trembled on the edge of transformation. The story of a banished noble was becoming the story of England itself. Proof that sometimes history does not crown those who seek power, but those who answer the call when power has lost its way. The chronicles would later say it simply: the exile returned and England followed. It was the moment when the cause of one man became the revolution of a kingdom. By late July of 1399, England was awake. What had begun as a quiet return in the rain-soaked north had become a campaign that moved like a gathering tide. Henry Bolingbroke, the once banished son of John of Gaunt, now rode at the head of an ever-growing host. Yet he did not march as a conqueror. His banners did not bear the emblems of rebellion, but the calm, deliberate words of purpose, justice, and restoration. Town after town opened its gates without resistance. Nobles who had sworn loyalty to Richard II began to appear in Henry's camp, riding through the dusk with measured excuses. They had come, they said, not to defy the king, but to protect the realm. Each new arrival brought with him men, supplies, and, more importantly, legitimacy. Henry, cautious but resolute, accepted their pledges with the air of a man who understood the gravity of what was unfolding. He still claimed, with formal restraint, that his cause was not the throne. Yet even as he said it, England seemed to answer differently. The discontent that had long simmered beneath Richard's reign now had a name, a face, a purpose. Henry became its vessel, and through him, the kingdom began to cleanse itself of years of neglect. His speeches were brief, practical, spoken not in the florid tones of courtly rhetoric, but in the measured cadence of a commander. "We ride," he would say, "for England's honor, for rightful inheritance, for the law that binds both noble and crown." It was enough. In a time when words had lost meaning, his simplicity felt like truth. Across the Channel in Ireland, King Richard II was concluding what he imagined to be a display of power. He had led a grand expedition there, meant to prove his strength and discipline the Irish chieftains. His army was vast, his baggage train magnificent, but his absence from England had created a vacuum, and into that vacuum Henry had stepped. When word of Henry's return reached him, Richard dismissed it at first as rumor. But rumors have a way of growing when truth is their root. The news worsened with each messenger. Lancaster's lands reclaimed, northern lords sworn to Henry, London wavering. At first the king hesitated. He delayed his departure, confident that his name alone could quell rebellion. "They will not rise against their anointed sovereign," he told his council, but the faces around him betrayed doubt. Some of his captains whispered of ships missing from the docks. Others spoke of letters unanswered. When Richard finally set sail for home, the wind was no longer in his favor. The seas were rough, the tides reluctant. His ships scattered in storm and mist, as if the elements themselves resisted his return. By the time he landed in South Wales, Henry had already crossed half the kingdom. The scene that awaited Richard was not one of loyalty, but of silence. The nobles he summoned did not come. The forces he expected had dwindled. The gold meant to pay his soldiers had vanished with his treasurers, who had already pledged fealty elsewhere. The king, once surrounded by ceremony and song, now found himself surrounded by uncertainty. Still, he rode on, proud, determined, and increasingly alone. He camped in the valleys of Wales, expecting his lords to rally to his banner. But the banners never appeared. One by one, his allies disappeared into the fog of indecision. Some deserted outright, others simply rode away at night and did not return. The chroniclers describe those nights as haunting. In one account, the king is said to have walked through his camp, the fires burning low, the rain whispering against empty tents. The soldiers bowed their heads but avoided his gaze. It was the look of men who already belonged to another cause. The next morning, when Richard rose, half the camp was gone. Horses missing, wagons abandoned, even his captain's pavilion stood open to the wind. The rain fell harder, blurring the outlines of his world. The man who had once been adored as the mirror of majesty now stood alone in the mud, the crown still heavy on his brow, but the air around him emptied of reverence. In the Chronicles, this moment marks the turning of the age, not the clash of armies, but the collapse of belief. England did not overthrow Richard with swords. It simply stopped believing in him. The divine right he had claimed so fiercely dissolved in silence. As the news reached Henry, he is said to have paused in his march. He did not celebrate. There was no triumph in his expression, only an austere awareness that history had moved beyond choice. "The realm chooses," he told his captains quietly, "and I must answer." What followed was not conquest, but consequence. Henry's campaign gathered momentum not from violence, but from inevitability. By the time he reached Bristol, half the kingdom had declared for him. The other half merely waited to see which wind would prevail. And so, while one man marched in rain toward London, another wandered through a dying camp in Wales. Two destinies moved toward each other, one born of patience, the other undone by pride. In the fading light of that summer, the story of England shifted. The throne that had once seemed immortal now trembled on uncertain ground. Richard still wore the crown, but its weight had changed. It was no longer a symbol of divine right. It had become a burden of memory, a golden echo of a glory that had already passed. The chroniclers would later write that a king's greatest defeat is not in battle, but in the hearts of those who stop following him. That night, beneath the Welsh rain, Richard learned that truth in silence. His empire was not conquered, it had simply walked away. The sun was sinking low over the coast of Flint when King Richard II and Henry Bolingbroke at last stood face to face. The air was heavy with the scent of the sea, and the gulls wheeled above the battlements, their cries sharp and distant. The castle itself, a fortress of stone and shadow, seemed to hold its breath. Within its walls, two men who had once shared laughter and kinship now met as symbols of a kingdom divided between divine right and earthly power. Richard had arrived first, exhausted and diminished, though still wrapped in the trappings of majesty. The purple cloak hung loosely around his shoulders. The gold circlet upon his brow seemed too bright, as if defying the twilight that crept over the land. He stood on the rampart overlooking the sea, his face pale, his expression one of quiet disbelief. The sound of hooves on wet ground broke the stillness, and from the road below Henry's banner appeared, the red of Lancaster flickering like fire against the dimming light. For a moment the king closed his eyes. In that instant perhaps he saw not his rival but the cousin of his youth, the companion from tournaments and feasts, the boy who had once sworn loyalty beside him. But the years had changed them both. The crown had made one man distant. Exile had made the other determined. When Henry entered the courtyard, he dismounted without ceremony. There was no triumph in his bearing, only composure. The two men approached slowly, the echo of their footsteps mingling with the whisper of the tide. The soldiers around them, Richard's few remaining guards and Henry's retinue, stood in rigid silence, knowing they were witnessing the quiet end of an age. Richard spoke first. His voice was calm, steady, but beneath it ran the strain of disbelief. "Cousin," he said, "you have returned sooner than I expected. Do you come as subject or as sovereign?" Henry bowed his head slightly, not too low, not in mockery, but with deliberate respect. "As your subject, my lord," he replied, "and as the rightful heir to my father's lands. Nothing more." The words hung in the air, poised between truth and irony. For though Henry claimed no crown, the balance of power had already shifted. Around him stood the loyalty of England, Around Richard, only the remnants of ritual. The king's gaze hardened. "If that is all you seek, then why does half my realm ride under your banner?" Henry's answer was simple. "Because, sire, they no longer see justice in your cause. They follow not me, but the promise that law and fairness may yet return." There was no anger in his tone, only clarity. It was the voice of a man who knew that history had already decided. Richard looked away, to the horizon where the last light faded into the sea. The gulls wheeled again, their cries lost to the wind. For a long moment, neither spoke. The distance between them was more than space. It was the span between ideal and reality, between divine kingship and the will of the governed. Richard had ruled as if ordained by heaven. Henry had risen because the earth beneath that heaven had shifted. When the king finally turned back, his voice was quieter, almost tender. "Do you know what it means to be chosen by God, Henry?" Henry met his gaze. "Perhaps," he said, "it means to serve those whom God created before the crown." It was not defiance, but truth. And Richard, for the first time, seemed to hear it. His shoulders sank slightly, as if the weight of his robes had at last revealed itself. The scene unfolded beneath a sky of fading gold. The chroniclers would later write that at that hour, the setting sun cast long shadows across the courtyard, one falling from the king, the other from the man who would soon replace him. They met in the center, indistinguishable. When Richard stepped forward, he removed his gloves, his gesture controlled, almost regal. "If I yield," he said softly, "let it be to England, not to you." Henry bowed once more. "Then England shall remember you with mercy." No sword was drawn, no proclamation declared. The exchange itself was the moment, the instant when legitimacy bent before reality. As the last light slipped from the stones of Flint Castle, the king, who had believed himself untouchable, looked upon the man who would soon take his place. There was no hatred, only recognition, the solemn understanding that power, once surrendered by faith, cannot be reclaimed by right. That evening, when the doors of the castle closed and the torches dimmed, Richard II ceased to rule in all but name. The chroniclers would later write, "And so the crown bowed before the man who once bowed before the crown." It was the quietest of downfalls, a whisper against the sea, a fading of sunlight across the ramparts. But it was enough to mark the moment when England changed its king. The coronation of Henry IV was held in October 1399 beneath the vaulted ceilings of Westminster Abbey. The candles burned high, casting their light upon banners newly embroidered with the sigil of Lancaster. The choir sang, solemn and clear, and the realm looked on with a mixture of relief and uncertainty. For England, it seemed, had found its order again. A king who promised justice, stability, and the restoration of honor. Yet even within the sacred echoes of the abbey, a shadow lingered. The question of what to do with the man who had once worn the crown. Richard II, the fallen monarch, was taken to Pontefract Castle in the north, a fortress as cold as the judgment that had condemned him. He was not tried, no formal sentence was spoken. Officially, he was only held for safekeeping. In truth, he had become a problem that no one dared to name. The new king could not rule freely while the old one lived, and yet the thought of blood on Lancaster hands haunted every corridor of Henry's conscience. The chronicles record that the deposed king was quiet in his captivity. He spent his days walking along the stone corridors, speaking little, sometimes humming to himself, sometimes reciting prayers in the half-dark. His attendants treated him with deference, but no affection. Once, a guard wrote that he looked through us as though we were ghosts. Perhaps in his mind, he already was one. Winter fell upon Pontefract. The days grew shorter, the air sharp with frost. Messengers came and went from London, their words sealed in wax and secrecy. Then one day, the castle gates closed to visitors, and for weeks no word escaped its walls. When news finally came, it was delivered in the language of distance. Richard II was dead. No witness spoke openly of how it happened. Some said illness, others claimed despair, others still whispered of silence imposed by command. The truth was left to history, which prefers symbols to confessions. What mattered most was not how Richard died, but what his death revealed, that even victory bears its own curse. Henry IV ordered a royal funeral, stately and proper. The body, or what was claimed to be the body, was brought to London and buried among kings. The ceremony was grand but cold, an act of duty rather than of grief. Courtiers bowed, bishops prayed, and the bells of Westminster tolled in somber rhythm. Yet beneath the ritual lay unease, the awareness that the crown Henry wore had been purchased not only by courage, but by betrayal. In the years that followed, the new king would struggle with rebellion, illness, and guilt. His reign, though lawful, never escaped the shadow of how it began. The chroniclers, reflecting on his time, wrote words that still echo like a quiet warning. Power seized by the sword must answer to the sword. Thrones taken in betrayal are haunted by the cost of their making. Thus ended the story of Richard II, not in glory nor in tragedy, but in the stillness of consequence. A king who believed himself divine met the human truth of all power, that no crown rests easy on a head unguarded by conscience. And in that truth, England learned once more that every throne, no matter how golden, stands upon the fragile ground of faith, a faith that, once broken, exacts its price not in ceremony, but in silence. The throne of England stood silent for a moment between kings. The echo of Richard's fall had not yet faded, and yet the machinery of the realm demanded movement. There could be no pause in the rhythm of power, no void left where a crown once shone. In that fragile silence, Henry Bolingbroke, cousin, rebel, and now victor, became the axis upon which the fate of the kingdom turned. He had not merely defeated a monarch, he had undone an idea, that kingship was sacred and immutable. Now beneath the vaulted ceilings of Westminster, England waited to see whether the man who had broken the divine order could forge a new one. The bells of London rang on a gray October morning in 1399. Their echoes drifted through the mist over the Thames, rolling toward Westminster, where the realm gathered to witness the coronation of a new king. Henry Bolingbroke, now Henry IV of Lancaster, was to be crowned. The streets were crowded but quiet, the people unsure whether they were celebrating salvation or sin. They had seen too much in recent months. Rebellion, the fall of a king, whispers of betrayal. What they sought now was not glory, but stability. Though few could say what kind of peace could grow from a wound so fresh. Inside Westminster Abbey, the air was thick with incense and candlelight. The great arches soared overhead, the banners of England hung heavy from the rafters, and the choir's voices trembled against the stone. Every ritual was observed with precision, yet beneath the ceremony there lingered something uneasy, something no prayer could cleanse. The crown of England, gleaming upon its cushion, seemed to wait with its own silent judgment. Henry moved toward the altar slowly, each step echoing through the nave. His expression was calm, but his eyes betrayed the weight of the moment. He was about to take the throne not by inheritance, but by the turning of fortune, a victory that came at the cost of bloodless betrayal. Around him stood the great lords and prelates of England, their faces masks of loyalty, their minds measuring risk. They had helped him rise, but in their hearts they wondered whether the God they invoked would bless what had been taken rather than given. The archbishop lifted the crown high for all to see, its golden rim catching the flicker of hundreds of candles. The Latin hymns rose, solemn and distant, as Henry knelt upon the cold marble floor. The congregation bowed, and for a breath, the whole of England seemed to hold still. When the crown descended onto his head, a faint cheer rippled through the abbey, a sound less of triumph than of resignation. The people outside heard the bells and knew the deed was done. The age of Richard had ended, and a new chapter had begun, though few believed it would be one of peace. Henry rose, the crown glinting faintly in the dim light. His face was stern, almost ascetic. The weight of gold on his brow seemed already to press downward. He swore his oaths to rule with justice, to defend the faith, to protect the realm, and his voice was steady, but the words rang hollow to those who listened closely. When he turned to face his subjects, he saw admiration in some eyes, suspicion in others, and in all of them, the reflection of a truth he could not escape. No ceremony, however grand, could erase the mark of usurpation. Outside the abbey, the city burned with torchlight. Bells clanged and bonfires flickered on the bridges. But even celebration carried a strange restraint, as though London itself was holding its joy in check. In taverns, men drank to the new king, but did so quietly, lowering their voices when speaking of Richard. Some called Henry a savior, others a thief whom God had chosen to tolerate. Among the clergy, a saying began to circulate in whispers: "No coronation can wash away the sin of a stolen crown." In the months that followed, the uneasy glory of that day began to fade. Henry's government, newly formed, stood upon sand. The treasury was empty, the kingdom restless. The nobles who had cheered him now turned their eyes toward their own rewards. In the north, the powerful Percys, father, son, and uncle, the Earls of Northumberland and Hotspur, grew impatient, their loyalty as conditional as the promises they had been given. They had helped Henry to the throne and now expected their price. Rebellions flickered like sparks in the damp air. In Wales, discontent smoldered among those who had suffered under English rule. Along the Scottish border, raiders tested the strength of the new regime. Within court, factions whispered behind closed doors. The crown that Henry wore each day glittered in the light of his council chamber, but its weight grew heavier with every petition, every rumor, every night spent awake over matters of coin and loyalty. The merchants of London hesitated to lend him funds. Parliament pressed for control over royal expenditure, something no king before him had granted so freely. Henry's claim to the throne rested on fragile moral ground. He could not afford to seem tyrannical. His rule had to be one of balance, diplomacy, and cautious restraint. He signed charters with careful hands, addressed Parliament with humility, and reminded his subjects that he had risen for England, not for ambition. Yet each time he spoke those words, even he seemed uncertain whether he still believed them. Through that first winter, his sleep was broken and fitful. The nights were long and heavy with wind. Those who served him closely noticed his restlessness, the way he paced the corridors of Westminster Palace long after the torches burned low, the way he sometimes paused before the great seal of state, his hand trembling slightly before he pressed it into wax. Some nights, he would sit in the chapel alone, the faint light of a single candle flickering over the golden circlet he now wore uneasily. He had ordered Richard buried honorably, laid to rest among the kings of old. Yet the thought of that quiet death at Pontefract would not leave him. In moments of solitude, he imagined the face of the cousin he had deposed, not as an enemy, but as a mirror. The ghost of Richard lived not in the dungeons of history, but in Henry's conscience. The silence of the former king had become the voice of the present one. Courtiers began to notice a change in their sovereign. The boldness of the usurper softened into the gravity of a penitent ruler. He gave generously to the church, endowed monasteries, and filled his private hours with confession and prayer. But peace remained distant. When he sat in council, he touched the rim of his crown absently, as though testing whether it still fit or whether it burned. He began to see the monarchy itself not as glory, but as burden. The triumph that had lifted him was turning into a slow erosion of spirit. His advisers called him cautious, even wise, but some saw that caution for what it was: fear. He feared rebellion, betrayal, and divine judgment in equal measure. The people who had once hailed him as the restorer of order now murmured that the new king seemed old before his time, and perhaps he was. The weight of guilt can age a man faster than years. Henry's eyes, once sharp and bright, took on a hollow stillness. The lines around his mouth deepened, not from laughter, but from restraint. He governed diligently, never indulgently, as though each decision were an act of penance. The crown upon his head had ceased to be an emblem of triumph. It was now the physical manifestation of remorse. In the great hall of Westminster, beneath the painted shields of kings long gone, Henry sat often in silence after his council had dispersed. The sound of the Thames outside seemed distant, muted by the thick stone walls. Those who passed by sometimes caught fragments of his voice, a whisper, a prayer, or a single word repeated softly to himself. It was said that once, when a servant entered unnoticed, he heard the king murmur, "Was it justice that I served, or only my own necessity?" The chroniclers who wrote of those years would later describe them as a reign shadowed by conscience. Henry governed with diligence and prudence, yet every achievement seemed dimmed by the manner of its beginning. His reforms were sound, his leadership steady, but the people's faith in the sanctity of kingship had been shaken. For the first time in generations, England saw that a king could fall and another could rise in his place. by the will of men, not God. It was a revelation both liberating and dangerous. The nobles who had helped crown Henry now understood that a crown could be taken as easily as given. The precedent he had set would outlive him. Each generation henceforth would remember that the divine right of kings could bend to human hands. As years passed, Henry's health began to falter. The sleeplessness deepened. His body grew frail. He continued to appear in council, still cloaked in royal dignity, but those close to him saw the effort it required. The crown no longer seemed a triumph of lineage, but a burden of endurance. Sometimes during royal processions, when the sunlight caught the crown's edge, observers thought they saw the faintest tremor in his hand as he raised it in greeting. To the crowd, it was a gesture of majesty. To those who knew, it was the reflex of a man who could still feel its weight pressing down. Henry IV ruled England for more than a decade, a reign marked not by conquest or splendor, but by the uneasy peace of survival. He restored order, yes, but not serenity. He brought stability, but not forgiveness. The ghost of Richard II never left him. It lingered in every oath he swore, every law he signed, every night he faced alone. And so history would remember him, not as a tyrant, nor as a savior, but as a man caught between redemption and regret. A king who wore his crown like an apology. A ruler whose triumph was inseparable from his transgression. The chroniclers wrote that he died as he had lived, quietly, dutifully, still asking for God's mercy. In their final reflection, they left a single line, simple and absolute. No coronation can wash away a sin of usurpation. The gold that crowns a victor also weighs upon his soul. And perhaps that was Henry's truest legacy. Not the power he seized, but the burden he carried after. For in the end, England learned that the crown, though made of gold, is forged from faith, and when faith is broken, the brightest metal becomes the heaviest chain. Yet even as Henry carried the weight of his uneasy crown, the world beyond Westminster refused to wait for his conscience to find peace. The land itself seemed to sense the tremor of a kingdom built on uncertain ground. Beneath the calm surface of order, old wounds began to stir in the borderlands. In the restless hearts of those who had long bent the knee to England, from the misted hills and valleys of Wales came whispers of defiance, faint at first, then growing louder, like wind before a storm. While the king prayed for absolution in his chapel, another man far to the west was preparing to turn grievance into destiny. The first sparks of rebellion came not from a court, nor from a battlefield, but from the misty hills of Wales, a land of rain, stone, and stubborn pride. It began, as so many great upheavals do, with an insult. Owain Glyndŵr, a Welsh noble of ancient lineage, a scholar once trained in the law of England, had long served loyally under the crown. Yet in the year 1400, a dispute over land between him and a neighboring lord, an Englishman favored by the court, ignited something far greater than a personal grievance. When the king's justices ruled against him, denying not only his claim, but his dignity, the insult struck deeper than politics. It struck at the very soul of Wales. Owain withdrew to his estate at Sycharth, a place of rolling hills, oak forests, and singing streams. Those who visited said it was less a fortress than a haven, filled with poets, musicians, and the warmth of Welsh hospitality. But beneath that peace, something was changing. The humiliated noble became a symbol of the nation's buried anger. Word spread quietly through the valleys. The crown had mocked one of their own. The memory of centuries of conquest and suppression stirred. By autumn, fires were burning in the hills. It began with small bands of men, farmers, outlaws, former soldiers, gathering under Owain's banner. They rode through the mists with torches, their faces hidden, their voices carrying songs older than the English crown itself. Each raid, each village reclaimed, was both vengeance and prophecy. Wales, long silent beneath English rule, had found its voice again. The chroniclers in London called it treason. The Welsh called it awakening. Owain was no reckless rebel. He moved with strategy, speaking to his followers not of hatred, but of destiny. "We are not rising against men," he told them, "but against forgetting." His charisma bound the tribes and clans together in a unity unseen for generations. The red dragon of Cadwallader, symbol of ancient Welsh kings, was raised once more. The land itself seemed to conspire with him. The narrow valleys and dense forests of Wales were his fortress. English knights trained for open field battles found themselves lost in fog and ambushed by shadows. Rain turned roads into rivers. Mountains swallowed armies whole. Each hill became a citadel, each village a garrison of defiance. The English chroniclers, accustomed to the measured wars of kings, struggled to describe what they saw. They wrote of phantoms in the mist, of soldiers vanishing between the trees, of campfires seen on distant ridges where no army should be. It was not war as they knew it. It was something older, something elemental. In the evenings, the Welsh rebels lit signal fires upon the mountains. Seen from afar, they looked like constellations come down to earth, the stars of a nation reborn. Shepherds and miners joined the cause. Priests blessed them in secret. Even women and children carried messages across the hills, their silence as brave as any sword. As the revolt spread, Owain began to dream not only of freedom, but of a kingdom restored. His followers called him Prince of Wales, not in jest, but in faith. Letters were sent to Scotland, to France, to the Pope himself, declaring the rebirth of the Welsh nation. He wrote in Latin, in French, and in the ancient tongue of his ancestors, his words filled with both diplomacy and poetry. He spoke of justice, of culture, of the right of a people to govern themselves. For England, it was more than rebellion. It was humiliation. A land they believed pacified for generations now stood aflame. The crown's messengers rode day and night to London bearing grim news. Castles besieged, towns sacked, local lords in hiding. The rebellion that began as a spark of pride was becoming a wildfire of conviction. Henry IV, already worn by illness and guilt, faced a test unlike any he had known. His kingdom was not yet secure, his finances crumbling, his nobles divided. Now the very fringes of his realm threatened to slip from his grasp. The lords at his council spoke of the Welsh as savages, but Henry knew better. He saw in Owain not savagery, but reflection. Another man driven by the force of destiny, another soul who believed that righteousness could reshape the world. Yet for all his understanding, he could not yield. A king who had seized the crown could not afford to lose a province. The war against Wales began in earnest, a campaign of endurance fought as much against nature as against men. But in those first years, it was Wales that held the advantage. The forests whispered the name of Owain Glyndŵr. The mountains sheltered him like an old friend. The fires upon the ridges burned brighter each night, signaling to the valleys below that the dream of freedom, so long buried under stone and silence, had been reborn. And so it was that an insult, spoken in a courtroom far from the mountains, gave rise to a legend. The chroniclers in England would call him a rebel. The poets of Wales would call him deliverer. Between those two truths lay the enduring paradox of history, that one man's rebellion is another's redemption. As winter came and the snow fell across the high passes, travelers swore they could still see the glow of distant flames moving through the mist. Not armies, but memories. Wales was awake, and the dream would not easily sleep again. While the western hills still glowed with the last embers of Welsh defiance, another heat began to gather, where the land hardens into moor and border tower. The king's riders brought word that the fires in Wales were not dying so much as spreading their light, casting long shadows across the north, where honor is kept like iron and insult rusts nothing but patience. In London, Henry counted coins and scruples. In Northumberland, proud men counted debts unpaid and promises unkept. The wind that carried the scent of wet bracken from Glyndŵr's valleys now carried a different smell, cold steel and colder resolve. And as the ridgelines of Wales faded behind the realm, the high walls of Percy's strongholds rose ahead, waiting, watchful, and ready to answer grievance with a banner. The smoke from Wales had barely thinned before another fire began to kindle in the north, quieter at first, but more dangerous. It came not from peasants or patriots, but from nobles, men whose swords had once raised Henry IV to the throne. Chief among them was the Percy family of Northumberland, Henry Percy the Elder, called the Earl of Northumberland, and his son Henry Hotspur Percy, whose courage and temper had made him the idol of soldiers and the terror of his enemies. In the years following Henry's coronation, the Percys had been indispensable. They had guarded the northern frontier against the Scots, financed armies when the royal treasury was dry, and quelled unrest when the crown's reach faltered. Yet, for all their loyalty, the rewards had not come. Titles were delayed, debts unpaid, and royal promises faded into silence. The Percys, proud and accustomed to respect, began to feel the sting of neglect. The borderlands they ruled were unlike the polished courts of London, a world of cold winds, fortified towers, and constant war. Power there was not maintained by words but by presence. To the northern lords, honor was currency. An insult could ruin as swiftly as a sword. When the king began to interfere in their governance, appointing his own men to offices the Percys considered their birthright, the line between discontent and defiance grew thin. There was also the matter of Scotland. After the Battle of Homildon Hill in 1402, Hotspur had captured dozens of Scottish nobles, hostages worth fortunes in ransom. According to custom, those ransoms belonged to the captors, but Henry, desperate for funds, demanded that they be handed over to the crown. It was the final insult. 2. Strip a northern noble of his reward was to question his standing, his very dignity. Letters began to pass between Northumberland, Hotspur, and others disillusioned with Lancaster rule, men who had once called themselves allies. The talk was cautious at first. Reform, redress, justice. But by the following year, the words had hardened into revolt. In the halls of Alnwick Castle by candlelight, the Percys and their followers drew up their cause. They would demand a new order, one where the king's broken promises were answered by the sword. And at the heart of that cause stood Hotspur, young, impetuous, and brilliant. Hotspur was unlike his father, where the elder Percy was deliberate, even calculating. The son was fire given human form. He was brave to the point of recklessness, chivalrous to the point of tragedy. Chroniclers described him as a man of quick word and quicker deed, beloved by his soldiers for his courage, and despised by courtiers for his disdain of ceremony. To the north, he was a hero. To London, a storm. There was something of the old England in him, the spirit of knights who fought for glory rather than profit, who measured honor not in wealth, but in the weight of their name. He was restless in peace, magnificent in danger, and incapable of compromise. When he looked at the court of Henry IV with its intrigue and caution, he saw corruption. When he looked at the king himself, he saw the shadow of betrayal. Yet the story of Hotspur is not merely rebellion. It is also the story of a generation divided, a generation where loyalty had lost its anchor. Among those who admired him was Prince Hale, the king's eldest son. Hal was everything Hotspur was not: urbane, witty, drawn to taverns and mischief. To the court, Hal seemed unworthy of his inheritance, while Hotspur appeared the very model of a prince. The people whispered comparisons, dangerous ones, that the crown sat on the wrong brow. For a time, the two young men represented opposing futures of England. Hotspur, the old code of chivalric valor. Hal, the new pragmatism of kingship yet to come. Fate, with cruel precision, would bring them to the same battlefield. When Hotspur raised his standard in the summer of 1403, the rebellion spread swiftly across the north. Men flocked to him, knights who had fought beside him, common soldiers who adored him. The cry was not treason, but justice. They claimed they rose not against England, but against misrule. Their banners bore the lion and crescent of the Percys. Their hearts beat with the conviction of righteousness. Henry IV moved with grim resolve. He knew the danger of hesitation. To allow Hotspur to unite with his Welsh allies under Glyndŵr would mean disaster. The king gathered his forces and marched north with a speed that astonished friend and foe alike. His army, though weary from years of conflict, carried one purpose: to prove that the crown, once seized, would not easily be taken again. The two armies met near Shrewsbury under the heavy heat of July. The field was broad and uneven, hemmed in by woods and hedges, the air thick with the scent of grass and thunder. To the west, clouds gathered, a storm waiting to break. Hotspur's men arrived first, taking the high ground. His banner, white lion on crimson, fluttered in the wind. His ranks were disciplined, proud, drawn from the North's best warriors. Across the plain, the royal army unfurled its own standard, the leopards of England and the red rose of Lancaster. Between them lay the silence before ruin. At dawn, trumpets sounded. The first volleys of arrows darkened the sky, their hiss like rain upon metal. The battle that followed was fierce, not for conquest, but for legitimacy itself. Fathers fought sons. Cousins faced one another beneath different banners. This was no foreign war. It was England at war with its own reflection. Hotspur rode at the front, his energy boundless, his voice clear above the clamor. To his men, he was more than a commander. He was the embodiment of their defiance, a living symbol of what they believed England ought to be. The king, too, rode among his soldiers, his presence a mixture of command and penitence. For him, this was not only survival, but judgment. The fighting raged through the day. Arrows filled the air, trumpets blared, dust and smoke mingled until the sun itself seemed to vanish. The young Prince Hal fought bravely beside his father, earning wounds and glory in equal measure. Those who saw him said it was as if the careless youth had vanished, replaced by a man destined for kingship. As evening fell, word spread that Hotspur was struck down, not in cowardice, but in valor. When the news reached his men, their courage faltered. The banner of the Percys wavered, then fell. The rebellion died with its brightest flame. Henry IV stood over the field as the storm finally broke, rain washing the dust from his armor. He had won, but the victory was hollow. The crown remained his, but each triumph seemed to carve a deeper mark upon his conscience. Across the soaked fields of Shrewsbury lay not merely the dead, but the dreams of a generation that had believed in honor more than power. In the years to come, poets would make of Hotspur a legend, the knight who defied a king, the hero who fell for pride and principle. And perhaps, in some quiet hour, Henry himself remembered him not as a traitor, but as a mirror, the reflection of what he might have been had destiny drawn its line differently. Thus ended the rebellion of the Percys, a rebellion not born of ambition, but of disillusionment. Yet in its fall, it revealed the truth that would haunt every ruler after Henry, that no king, however rightful or strong, can command the hearts of men who no longer believe in the justice of his crown. The fires of rebellion in Wales had dimmed to smoldering embers, yet the air of England was far from calm. The smoke that drifted from those western hills did not vanish. It merely changed direction. It carried with it a restless discontent, curling northward into the cold winds of Northumberland. The king, weary and marked by sleepless nights, had hoped that subduing Wales might restore his peace. But as he stared into the dark of council chambers, his messengers brought new tidings, tidings not of foreign revolt, but of betrayal growing within the very hands that had once lifted him to power. The mountains of Wales had burned with passion, the north now trembled with pride, and as one flame faded, another began to rise, slower, steadier, and far more perilous, the fire that would bear the name Percy. In the years that followed Shrewsbury, the fire of rebellion faded, but another conflict began, not upon the field, but within the royal house itself. Prince Hal, the heir to the throne, walked a narrow line between disgrace and destiny. To London's taverns he fled, away from the weight of expectation, into a world of laughter, mischief, and fleeting freedom. There, in the smoky halls of Eastcheap, he drank with thieves and jesters, trading the language of court for the rough music of the streets. To the watching nobles, it was scandal, the son of a king consorting with drunkards and pickpockets. To the people, it was a paradox. He was at once loved and pitied, the prince who sought humanity in the company of the forgotten. Some said he was lost. Others whispered that he was learning something the court could never teach, the pulse of the common heart. For Henry IV, the sight of his son's dissipation was a torment. The king had built his reign on discipline, caution, and the constant burden of guilt. Now he looked upon a son who seemed to mock all that sacrifice. Between father and son stretched a silence deeper than anger, the silence of two men bound by love, pride, and misunderstanding. Hal's laughter in Eastcheap was not without purpose. Beneath the disguise of frivolity, he watched, listened, and learned. He saw how men spoke of kings, what they loved, and what they feared. In the coarse banter of his companions, he discovered truth stripped of ceremony. One day, he confided to a friend, "They shall see me for what I am, and not for what I seem." That one day came sooner than he expected. The king's health was failing. His body, worn by years of rule and remorse, began to betray him. He suffered long nights without rest, the crown lying close at hand, as if its weight pressed upon him even in sleep. Courtiers whispered of his decline, of his fits of weakness and fainting spells. And through the palace corridors drifted another rumor, that the Prince of Wales would never be ready, that England might soon lose not only a king, but the faith that held it together. Hal returned to the palace, summoned by duty and by something quieter, perhaps love, perhaps guilt. He found his father changed, the stern monarch now frail, his once commanding voice subdued. In those dim chambers, heavy with the scent of incense and age, the long-delayed reckoning between father and son began. Henry IV lay upon his bed, the crown resting beside him on a small table. Its gold had dulled, its edges worn from years of worry. He turned to his son, his gaze sharp despite his weakness. "You waste your youth in taverns," the king said, his voice thin but steady, "while I, who took this crown in sin, have spent my life paying for it. Do you know, Hal, what this costs? Every breath of a king is bought with the silence of his conscience." Hal knelt beside him, silent. The words stung, not because they were unjust, but because they were true. The king continued, "You think kingship is glory. It is endurance. You think the crown shines. It burns. I won it through rebellion, and I have worn it in repentance. If you take it lightly, it will consume you." Hal bowed his head. "Father, I know I have been a disappointment, but I swear, the man you fear I am, he will die before you do. The son you wanted will rise in his place." Henry's eyes softened, a flicker of the father beneath the monarch. "Then rise soon," he said, "for the realm will not wait long." That night, when the king fell into uneasy sleep, Hal sat alone by his bedside. The candlelight flickered across the crown beside his father's hand. The young prince reached out almost without thinking and lifted it. It was heavier than he had imagined. He held it in his lap, staring at it, the symbol of everything he had run from and everything he was destined to bear. When the king awoke and saw the crown gone, he called for his son. Hal returned immediately, the crown in his hands. "Why?" Henry asked. His voice trembled with anger or fear or both. Hal placed the crown gently back upon the table. "Not to claim it, father," he said softly. "To know what it felt like, and to learn that I am not yet worthy." For a moment there was silence. Then the king reached out, his hand trembling, resting upon his son's. "Perhaps," he murmured, "you are more worthy than you think." They sat together, the old king and the heir, the past and the future of England, in one quiet room. Between them lay the crown, not as a prize, but as a confession. When Henry IV died, England did not rejoice or mourn as it had for other kings. The nation seemed simply to exhale, as though ending a long, weary chapter. Hal ascended the throne as Henry V, and with him came the promise of renewal, a son rising not merely to rule, but to redeem. Historians would later call it a reconciliation through inheritance, the sins of the father transmuted into the resolve of the son. Yet even in triumph, the cycle endured. The crown, that ancient circle of gold, carried with it not only authority, but memory. For power in England, as in all realms, was never a gift. It was a burden passed from hand to hand, generation to generation, each believing they could bear it better, each discovering that it bears them instead. The chroniclers wrote that in his final hours, Henry IV whispered, "God forgive me, that I took what was not mine," and that Henry V, standing beside him, replied quietly, "Then let me spend my life to prove it was not in vain." History is filled with such inheritances of guilt, of hope, of endless striving. The throne is not a seat of comfort, but a mirror that reveals the truth of those who sit upon it. And so it was that father and son, divided by youth and pride, were joined at last by the weight of the same crown. The world remembers their victories and their wars, but perhaps the greater story lies in that quiet room, where a dying king and his restless heir learned that no one is born to rule. There are only those who learn to endure the crown. The rain-soaked fields of Shrewsbury slowly faded into memory, but the scars of that day lingered far longer than the dead. For though the rebellion had ended in thunder and steel, the kingdom Henry ruled was not at peace. It merely paused, as if catching its breath. The northern winds that once carried war now whispered uncertainty, and in the stillness that followed, the king turned his gaze inward. Victory had secured his crown, yet it could not still the unrest that lived in his own blood. The nation was quiet, but his heart was not. And so, as the banners of the fallen were folded and buried, England entered a different kind of struggle, one not fought with swords, but with souls. In the silence after rebellion came the soft echo of another conflict, deeper and more intimate. The quiet distance between a father who had fought too hard to keep his crown and a son who had not yet learned what it meant to wear one. When Henry IV finally closed his eyes in the spring of 1413, the bells of London rang through the cold morning air with a strange calm. It was not the sound of mourning or triumph, but of release. The long reign of a troubled king had ended, and with it, the uneasy weight that had pressed upon England for more than a decade. The man who had taken the throne by rebellion, who had ruled through storms of guilt and rebellion, was gone, and in his place stood a son who seemed born to redeem the father's burden. Prince Hal, now King Henry IV, walked through the echoing halls of Westminster as sunlight pierced through the stained glass, casting gold across his path. His coronation was not simply a ceremony of succession, it was a moment of national renewal. Where his father's crown had been heavy with conscience, his seemed almost effortless, as though the kingdom itself had been waiting for his touch. The nobles, who had once looked upon him with disdain, now saw hope in his calm gaze. The clergy, once wary of the Lancaster throne, offered their blessing with full voice. And beyond the abbey's walls, the common people cheered until their voices cracked, for they believed that the young king would bring them peace, honor, and glory. To them, the death of Henry IV was not a tragedy, but a kind of cleansing. The sins of the usurper, they thought, were washed away through the grace and promise of the Son. England, long divided by rebellion and doubt, breathed as though absolved. The crown that had once been a symbol of guilt now shone again as a beacon of strength. Henry V understood that this faith was both gift and test. He had lived among the people, walked their streets, and shared their laughter. He knew what they longed for. They did not need a monarch who apologized for his right to rule. They needed one who made that right undeniable. And so the young king began his reign, not with vengeance, but with reconciliation. He called home exiles. He forgave those who had risen against his father. He restored lands that had been seized in anger. To some, these acts seemed naive, but to Henry they were the foundation of something greater. He would rule by unity, not fear. He would prove that the House of Lancaster, born in rebellion, could stand through righteousness. Yet even as his reign began in peace, he knew the legacy he carried. His father had taught him, not through words but through weariness, that a crown is both blessing and burden. He had seen Henry IV struggle under its weight, seen the sleepless nights, the haunted eyes, the slow decay of a man who wore repentance like armor. Now, as the young king looked into the polished gold of that same crown, he understood that his duty was not merely to wear it, but to justify it. In the months that followed, he became the image of discipline and resolve. He silenced doubt with action, turned suspicion into loyalty. The nobility who had once whispered about his wild youth now bowed before his authority. The church declared him God's chosen defender. The people, for the first time in many years, felt that their king and their kingdom were one. But peace alone would not secure his dynasty. Henry knew that legitimacy, once questioned, must be cemented in something more enduring than goodwill, and so his eyes turned across the narrow sea toward France, a realm fractured by civil war and weak leadership. There, opportunity waited, and with it, the chance to transform a dynasty born in rebellion into one sanctified by conquest. The drums of war would come soon enough. The young king who had once laughed in taverns would one day command armies and carve his name into history at Agincourt. Yet even then, those victories would not erase the shadow of the man who had made them possible. Henry III's legacy remained, woven into the quiet discipline of his son's rule. The old king's reign had been a crucible, one that burned away illusion and left behind endurance. He had not sought glory, only stability. He had not dazzled his people, only held the realm together when it threatened to break apart. His was the reign of necessity, not triumph, but without it, the age of glory that followed could never have been born. 2 centuries later, when Shakespeare took up his pen, he found in Henry IV's story a reflection of all human rule, the struggle between guilt and duty, pride and humility, power and conscience. In his plays, Henry IV is not the villain of history, but its philosopher, a man who understands too late that crowns are not rewards, but punishments for those strong enough to endure them. His line, "Uneasy lies the head that wears a crown," became more than poetry. It became truth eternal. Through that single thought, the king who had once been condemned as a usurper was transformed into a symbol of wisdom hard-won. In the shadow of that father stands the son, restless and radiant. The tension between them becomes the soul of Shakespeare's England, the old order giving way to the new, the guilty handing his burden to the pure. Their story is both personal and political, father and son, sin and redemption, history and legend merging into one continuous heartbeat. Modern historians, though less poetic, see Henry IV with equal reverence. They do not judge him by his conscience, but by his competence. To them, he was the first English king who ruled not as a warrior guided by divine right, but as a politician guided by reason. In an age of turmoil, he balanced factions, managed parliament, and laid the groundwork for a monarchy that could survive beyond charisma. His reforms in finance and governance, his cautious diplomacy, his measured restraint, all were the work of a man who understood that power must be maintained, not merely seized. He was a realist in an age of dreamers, a craftsman of stability in a century that worshipped chaos. And while his reign lacked the shining victories of his sons, it achieved something rarer, continuity, for a kingdom as restless as England. That alone was a miracle. The paradox of Henry IV is what makes him enduring. He was a rebel who feared rebellion, a usurper who became the protector of monarchy, a sinner who sought holiness through service. He was not loved, perhaps, but he was respected, and when he died, even those who had once cursed his name acknowledged that without his quiet endurance, the realm would have shattered. If Henry V embodied glory, Henry IV embodied endurance. The father built the foundation, the son built the legend, and yet, beneath the surface of triumph, one truth remained constant. The crown was never cleansed, only carried. Power, no matter how noble, is never pure. Each king inherits the sins of the one before him and adds his own, and so the circle continues, century after century. When Henry IV lay dying, with the crown resting beside him, he whispered a prayer that history would never forget. "God forgive me, that I took what was not mine." And his son, kneeling beside him, answered softly, "Then let me prove it was not in vain." Between those two sentences lies the essence of kingship, not in conquest or wealth, but in the endless effort to redeem what power itself corrupts. Through his son's victories, Henry IV's soul was cleansed. The crown that he had seized in rebellion was bathed in legitimacy through his heir's triumphs. Agincourt would become the sermon of his redemption, the proof that the line he founded had not been born in sin, but reborn in glory. The chroniclers of the time wrote that when England celebrated its victories, some whispered prayers for the father, as though his restless spirit might finally find rest. For in every triumph of the son was the echo of the father's struggle. The steel of Henry IV's will had been forged in the fire of Henry IV's conscience. And so, as generations passed, the image of Henry IV changed. No longer the thief of crowns, he became its guardian. No longer the destroyer of divine order, he became its keeper. The man who had taken the throne through rebellion ended as the man who preserved it through responsibility. His reign, once marked by guilt, came to symbolize redemption through endurance. He did not die a saint, but neither did he die a tyrant. He died as something rarer, a man who understood his flaws and bore them openly so that others might rule without fear. Even now, centuries later, his story endures because it speaks not of conquest, but of conscience. Every leader, every generation finds in him a reflection of their own struggle, the knowledge that power, no matter how justly gained, always demands atonement. And so, the tale of the two Henrys, father and son, guilt and grace, remains a cornerstone of England's memory. The one taught his country endurance, the other taught it greatness. Together, they built the bridge between survival and glory, between sin and redemption. History does not remember Henry IV with fireworks or fanfare. It remembers him with quiet respect as the man who steadied the realm when it trembled, who carried the burden so his son could rise unshaken. His greatness lies not in what he conquered, but in what he preserved. The usurper became the keeper of the crown. The man of guilt became the guardian of order, and through the light of his son, his shadow found peace. In the end, his story is not about how he took the throne, but how he bore it. He proved that kingship is not a birthright, but a test of the soul. The crown, he learned, is not a symbol of power, but a mirror, one that shows every flaw, every fear, and every flicker of redemption. And as the centuries have turned, his lesson has remained unchanged. No crown is ever truly won, only endured. The bells that hailed the sun's renewal faded into the ordinary hours of the realm, and with them the heat of judgment cooled into memory. What remained of Henry IV was not the tumult of his days, but the shape his burden had carved into the crown itself. Seasons turned. Victories gathered under the name of Henry V, and the father's guilt settled into the quiet strata of history where comparison begins. Scribes and scholars, looking backward from calmer shores, set his name beside other makers of dynasties and asked not how loudly he rose, but how steadily he held. Thus the story that had been lived in sleepless nights passed into ink and margin, and the usurper became a figure in a longer lineage, measured against conquerors and restorers alike, weighed not by thunder, but by endurance. In the long scroll of English kings, Henry IV stands among the uneasy few who took the crown not by birthright, but by boldness. He was not alone in that act of audacity. Before him had come William the Conqueror, the Norman duke who crossed the sea in 1066 to seize England by sword and claim divine sanction after the fact. After him would come Henry VII, the cautious victor of Bosworth, who ended civil war and built a dynasty upon the bones of both York and Lancaster. All three were founders born of rebellion, men who remade the kingdom by force and then spent their lives justifying it. William had ruled with fire and certainty, shaping England through conquest. His right was not debated because it was enforced. Henry VII ruled with calculation, weaving legitimacy out of careful marriage, myth, and the quiet terror of the Tower. But Henry IV's throne was neither won in foreign glory nor secured by cunning bloodlines. His was the loneliest of crowns, claimed from within, stolen not from strangers but from his own kin. Unlike William, he had no foreign claim. Unlike Henry VII, no final victory to seal his right. He was a usurper who had to become a king while already wearing the crown. That paradox defined him. His reign was a lesson written not in conquest or reform, but in endurance and guilt. Where others carved their legitimacy with armies or heirs, Henry forged his through sleepless nights, steady governance, and the painful honesty of knowing he could never be fully absolved. In the great ledger of monarchy, his entry reads like a warning that power seized without sanction must be carried with humility, or it will destroy the one who holds it. He never forgot the cost. Every rebellion that rose against him, from Percy's banners in the north to Glyndŵr's fires in the west, echoed the same accusation, that he was the false king, the interloper, the thief of crowns. And yet he endured. Perhaps that endurance was his redemption. Unlike tyrants who drown in their own ambition, Henry ruled not to glorify himself, but to preserve the realm. His caution, his weariness, his restraint, these were the virtues of a man who understood that the crown he took was heavier than he imagined. He was not a visionary, he was a survivor. And sometimes survival itself is a form of greatness. As history ripened into legend, Henry IV became a symbol, both warning and wisdom. He was the first of a new kind of monarch, not the divinely chosen, but the self-made, not ordained, but justified through endurance. In that sense, his reign speaks to a timeless paradox, the very soul of monarchy itself. To be king is to live in contradiction. Every monarch, no matter how rightful, carries a trace of usurpation, for every crown sits upon the conquered. Usurper and rebel king. The title once meant, as accusation became in the eyes of later centuries, the mirror of all sovereigns. It is the paradox of power itself, the act of taking what no mortal can truly deserve and then spending a lifetime trying to earn it. In Henry's story lies the lesson that every ruler must face, that legitimacy is not a birthright, but a performance. It must be renewed every day through action, justice, and endurance. A king who forgets this becomes a tyrant. One who remembers it becomes human. Henry's guilt made him fragile, but it also made him wise. The image of his death endures as an emblem of that truth. An aging man, once full of rebellion, lying in a chamber heavy with incense, the crown beside his hand. It gleamed softly in the candlelight, beautiful yet oppressive, the symbol of everything he had fought to gain and everything it had taken from him. It was said that as he touched it for the last time, he whispered not a prayer for victory, but for rest. The chroniclers later wrote that he died as a man weary of his own crown, and yet that weariness was not defeat. It was revelation, for in recognizing the weight of power, Henry IV became, perhaps for the first time in his life, truly royal. The crown, after all, is not merely gold and jewels. It is the burden of human will shaped into metal, a circle without end, signifying the eternal struggle between duty and desire. Every monarch who wears it inherits not only authority, but memory, the sins of those who came before, and the hopes of those who will follow. In this, Henry IV's legacy transcends his lifetime. He may have taken the crown in rebellion, but he left it purified by conscience. His rule taught that kingship is not sanctified by the manner of its birth, but by the integrity of its endurance. Centuries later, when his name is spoken, it no longer stirs anger or fear. Instead, it evokes reflection. He is remembered not as the villain of a stolen throne, but as the reluctant custodian of England's future. The rebel became the reformer, the sinner, the guardian. And though he never escaped the whisper of usurper, he transformed it into something nobler, a testament to the complexity of rule. To call him the usurper and rebel king is to acknowledge that every monarch, every leader bears some share of that rebellion against fate. Power, by its nature, is an act of trespass, a hand reaching toward the divine, grasping what no mortal should fully hold. Henry IV understood this better than any of his kind, and because he understood it, he ruled not with arrogance, but with the humility of one who knows the price of ambition. He died not as a conqueror, but as a man who had fought a quieter, harder war, the war within his own soul. His victories were not won on the battlefield, but in the endurance of sleepless nights, in the restraint of vengeance, in the constant struggle to prove that rebellion could give birth to order. And perhaps that is why his story endures, because it tells us something greater than history. It reminds us that legitimacy is never secure, that power is always fragile, and that the greatest kings are not those who believe they were chosen by heaven, but those who learn to carry the weight of earth. When he died, England did not collapse. The realm stood firm, prepared for the age of triumph that his son would bring. That alone is the measure of his reign. He had taken the crown in storm and passed it on in peace. And so, the final image of Henry IV lingers, a tired king, eyes half closed, fingers brushing the crown as though both blessing and farewell. He does not smile, he does not weep. He simply exhales, as if surrendering the burden he has carried too long. Outside, the bells of Westminster toll. In the silence that follows, England waits, ready for legend to begin. Henry IV dies not as a conqueror, not as a saint, but as a weary man who preserved a kingdom. And through that quiet death, he achieved something rarer than glory, understanding. His reign was born of rebellion, shadowed by guilt, but ended in truth. For in the story of England, every usurper must become a guardian, and every crown, no matter how bright, carries the weight of all who bore it before. And so, history closes his chapter with a line simple yet eternal. Henry IV died as a man weary of power, but his reign began the legend of England.